So I want to welcome you to your first industrial organizational psychology class, at least with me. So this is personnel psychology, which is often also referred to as industrial psychology. So the I and the O in industrial organizational psychology. Basically, industrial, we rarely use that term anymore. In fact, PSYOP has often tried to remove the I because it has kind of fallen out of use. But industrial is personnel. It is focused on the industry. It's focused on personnel management, personnel measurement, so selection, performance appraisal, training, and to some degree leadership development, though that starts to move over to the O side, which is more organizational. So another way to kind of think about it is that industrial or personnel psychology, and I'll use the two terms interchangeably, generally speaking, are focused more on the actual structures of the organization, the decision making within the organization, and the capitalization of human resources towards the goals of the organization. While organizational psychology is more focused on the individuals within the organization, what are they getting out of the organization? How are they being rewarded? What is their mental state allowing them to provide performance? So though industrial organizational psychology both focuses on the personnel or industrial side and organizational side, the goals are still the same. They're just coming at it from a different angle. The goal is still to have a productive workforce, a workforce that enjoys their job, is motivated, has high satisfaction, because those things are related to high performance. And at the end of the day, we're also focused on organizational goals, and organizational goals are generally performance. So I'm going to briefly kind of talk about a bit about the introduction to the master's program itself, but also this class in this set of slides. And I just want to remind you that even though this class is, at least this semester, 100% online, I am definitely available for in-person meetings throughout the semester. We'll occasionally be doing synchronous or everyone together at the same time Zoom meetings, though those will be fairly rare and as needed. But definitely, if you are feeling disconnected from either the program, your cohort, or this class, reach out. I am definitely willing to work with you to make sure that those issues are taken care of. So a bit of an introduction to me. My name is Joel T. Nadler. I have a PhD in applied psychology with a dual specialization. One of those specializations is industrial organizational psychology, and specifically my focus was more on the personnel industrial side. I also have a specialization in advanced statistics and psychometrics, so the actual measurement of human differences, personality differences, and differences in ability, which is often a key component in selection, in performance appraisal, in promotion, and in training. If you're training a skill, you need to know what the person's skill level is at prior to the training and whether the training is effective. If you're hiring for a specific role, you need to know, does the person have the required skills, knowledge, and ability to take on that role? And if you have someone already in the organization, you need to be able to define how well they're performing. You need to be able to measure performance, again, a human trait. And finally, of course, for promotion, again, you need to be able to decide what skills are necessary for that new role and whether or not the person has them. So that's kind of where my focus is. My email is obviously listed here. That's the best way to get a hold of me. I am very rarely away from some form of electronic device, and I'm one of those people that is very susceptible to what they call telepressure. So if you reach out to me via email, if you haven't heard back within 24 hours, assume for whatever reason I didn't get that email. Most of the time you're going to find I respond much quicker. I don't like to leave emails just sitting in my inbox. It bothers me. As far as my research interests, as we're moving forward in this program, one of your goals is, of course, to figure out who you want to work with as far as your own research and thesis. I refer to myself often as a shiny object researcher, and what that means is that I really don't have a single thing that I research. Broadly speaking, most of my research probably fits into two categories: social roles or stereotypes in the workplace, specifically how social roles or stereotypes impact decision making. So how does that O side concept of stereotypes impact I side or personnel side decision making? And the rest of my research probably falls into a broad category of measurement and psychometrics. However, I've done a lot of projects with students that don't necessarily fit into that. One example is violence in the workplace. Definitely not something I'm normally interested in, but I had a student that wanted to work with me, and that's what they were interested in. I've had students that have worked with me on issues of personality, such as psychopathy in the workplace. And again, that's more kind of moving towards a clinical psychological view of an industrial problem. But again, I was definitely willing to adapt. I also do a fair amount of individual consulting. This class, due to the challenges that we're currently facing and having to bring it online, will probably not involve an actual organized consulting project, but there may be some opportunities for volunteers to get involved with some consulting. I'm currently working with multiple organizations. There just really wasn't a project that fit well into this class, and already I'm kind of facing the challenges of teaching this class for the first time online. So I'll honestly admit to you, and I tend to be a fairly direct person, I made the choice not to kind of try to force a project into this class. If there had been one that had fit well, I would have definitely offered it. But to let you know, in the future, when you take other classes with me throughout the program, usually I will have consulting projects as a part of the class. And again, I'm probably anticipating at least some volunteer opportunity to get some real world experience. I forgot I had this little joke of my picture here. I should have checked the slides beforehand. Normally, I would have set this joke up better, asking about your celebrity lookalikes. Actually, the only celebrity I've ever been compared to in reality is Stephen King, which I don't think is a particularly pleasant comparison. I don't think he's a particularly attractive person. But it'd be nice if people compared me to George Clooney. So here's just a quick, I don't know what you call this, collage of interests. We'll definitely be having a Zoom meeting where if you have any questions about who I am and what I'm interested in, I'll definitely be willing to talk about that in that Zoom meeting. I'm just going to leave this up here for a few seconds. This is just a selection of things that I've done, kind of randomly selected from one of my Facebook pages of interest, people in my life, and things that I've done. So let's talk about what is IO psychology. So first thing I want to talk about a little bit is how does IO and other degrees in a similar field function or differ from each other? So again, we've kind of briefly discussed industrial organizational psychology is the application of psychology to workplace issues. I like to think about it as we are the traditional clinical psychologist with our notepad, but on the couch is not an individual, it's an organization. And just like a clinical psychologist, what we're wanting to do is diagnose the organization, find issues the organization is having, and those issues might be day-to-day small problems, they may be major problems, and then try to come up with a course of action to make the life of that organization better. So we're still applying psychological principles to real-world problems, but it's not an individual's problem, it's an organization's problem. Now, how does IO differ from an HR certificate or an MBA? We need to be able to understand what HR professionals do. We need to understand what the training of an MBA is. It's one of the reasons we actually have a requirement in this program that you take at least one MBA class. Because you're going to be working with HR professionals, you're going to be working with MBA, you may even be working in roles that they would normally take on. My viewpoint is this. If you take an HR certificate, which is usually a 1-year degree, or an MBA, which is often a 2-year degree, a Master of Business Administration, both of those degrees are not very selective. So that's the first thing, is that most HR certificate degrees, as long as you have a bachelor's degree, a PULSE, and honestly, a social security number that'll help pay for your education, you can probably get into an HR certificate program. MBA programs usually have cohorts of upwards to 100 people per class. And again, that's basically just kind of undergraduate all over again. And if you look at most MBA programs, they're also not very selective. It's fairly easy to get into an MBA program. IO programs are kind of still in the mindset of most other psychological master's programs or PhD programs in that they are selective. So that's the first thing, is that if you're looking at an organization that knows what an IO psychologist is, if they're looking at an applicant that has a master's in IO psychology and an applicant that has an MBA for the same job position, they're going to know that that IO student is probably quantifiably, objectively measurably smarter and more driven. because they had to make it through a selection process that was very difficult to get into the IO program in the first place. So that's the first thing, is you've kind of got a little bit of a just advantage in the job market, because as long as the person understands the difference themselves of IO psychology versus MBA, they know that most IO programs may have 100 people apply and only 10 are selected to come into that program, while an MBA program may have 100 apply and all 100 get in. So it's not a same stamp. It's not the same information. The degrees are different. An IO psychology degree is objectively a more rigorous and harder to get into program, and generally a more rigorous and hard to program to succeed. Most IO students, when they take MBA classes, are kind of surprised, quote unquote, how easy they are. MBA students rarely want to take our classes. They find them very difficult by comparison to their others. And that's, again, we've created a rigorous program based on the fact that we're selecting people that can succeed in that program. How also does it differ? I like to use the analogy of it's the difference between a mechanic and an engineer. A mechanic knows what to do to fix a car. They know how to find a problem, and when they find the problem, they have the most common solution, and that solution usually is the replacement wholesale of a part. In other words, they know enough to figure out what part's wrong, and if they find a part that isn't working, they know enough to change the part out for a different part. That's kind of what an HR MBA student is trained to do. They're trained to do basic diagnostics to find out where in the organization the problem is, and then to have an understanding of what is the best part that will work most of the time. How this differs from an industrial organizational student is we're teaching you to be science practitioners. We're teaching you to be research focused. We're teaching you to also do that diagnostic, what part is wrong, but then we're asking you to be an engineer. Can you fix the part that's already there? Does it need replaced? And if it needs replaced, does it need to be replaced by a carbon copy best practice part, or does it need to be replaced by a custom part that's really going to allow the organization to succeed better? Also, because you're a science practitioner and you have research experience, you know how to do measurement, you know how to do pre-test and post-test, that's also going to give you some information about testing whether the new part really does work better or not, whether you replaced it or whether you fixed it. So HR certificates and MBAs tend to be mechanics, and there's nothing wrong with a mechanic. And a mechanic most of the time can fix the problem fairly decently. They can get improvement. But an industrial organizational psychologist is an engineer. They can do what the mechanics do, but they can also go beyond it. They can ask deeper questions. They can do more finance or finessed fixes to the issues. So you're about to join a fairly elite group of people that have a master's degree in IO psychology, and most businesses recognize the difference and recognize the value. So I kind of talked about the science practitioner model, and that's another thing that makes us different. It's what defines industrial organizational psychology. Is of the other models, HR certificates, MBAs, and to some degree even other degrees such as organizational development, tend to be practitioner-only models. They're making practitioners, they're making mechanics. They're making people that have the basic tools to do diagnostics and that have the basic understanding of alternate tools, alternate parts, basically interventions that are more likely than not to work. We want you to also be a scientist. We don't want you to not be a practitioner. We're making applied students. We're making people that are going to go and work in organizations. That's practicing. But we also want you to not lose track of the scientist part, the part that asks research questions, that asks hypotheses, and then tests them. Is this the part that's truly not working? Is it a part that needs to be completely replaced? And by part, I'm talking about organizational structures, organizational policies. So for example, your selection system. A part might be a selection system that involves 2 online assessments and an interview, and it's hiring people that tend to leave the organization. So a practitioner alone might just go, well, we need to scrap that system and try something else. Here's a new selection system that other organizations have used fairly successfully. I bet it will work here. Let's fix it. The scientist is going to go, what part of that selection system is working? Which parts are causing the problem? Is it a wholesale we need to replace the entire selection system, or can we tweak it? Can we refine it? Can we repair it? Can we make it better? And if it is completely not functional, what is the best thing to replace it with? Back to practitioner. But once we replace it, I want to be a scientist again. Is it actually working better? I'm not going to rely on it worked better elsewhere, so I bet it's going to work better here. I want to know, is it actually the best solution for this organization specifically? And that really is the science practitioner model. Group work. So IO psychology, organizations are moving more and more to groups and teams. That's becoming kind of the standard in almost all organizations. Even organizations where groups and teams are not a perfect fit, like kind of blue collar manufacturing, you're still seeing attempts to move in this direction. So just be aware that that is a major part of industrial organizational psychology. It's probably not going to stop, and we're going to have a lot of group projects in this program. And you want to start building up your skill sets of how you work well in a group, how you make sure the group is doing well, and how you're making sure that you're holding your own self accountable to what you need to do to make sure the group succeeds. And also how to train other people to work in groups. I also want to briefly talk about networks. So again, we're just kind of talking big picture of some of the skill sets and some of the mindsets you want as you go through this program. So you definitely want to know what is IO psychology. You want to have an understanding of the uniqueness of IO psychology compared to other degrees. You want to build up your skills both as a scientist and a practitioner. You want to build up your skills working well with others and also teaching others to work well with others. And you're also wanting to think about the networks you're building. So honestly, you can have the best skill set in the world, and if you have no one looking out for you, no one giving you job leads, no one that's ever met you personally, it is going to be harder to find work. A part of the industrial organizational psychological kind of system is that it is a community. We have a national organization, SIOP. People recognize it as a distinct field. And having a good set of friends that are in the same field, working at various organizations, who can help you find work or find resources is an invaluable tool. So you want to build your networks while you're in this program. You want to make sure that not necessarily everyone in the cohort you are best friends with at the end, but you definitely want to make sure you don't burn any bridges. You definitely want to make sure that everyone thinks fairly well of you. So when you're in a group, if you decide to shuff off and not really do your work, you're hurting your network as well. You also want to be aware of, as within whatever is reasonable for you, you want to take advantages of opportunities to connect with the students above you, so your second years, and when you're a second year, the students coming in behind you, the new first years next year. That way, you're not just leaving here with a network of 10 fellow students, you're leaving it with a network of hopefully 20 to 30 students. You also want to make sure that you build your networks with all four of the faculty. All of us actually do a fair amount of work within the community. We have strong networks of alumni students ourselves, and we also have connections throughout the business world. And as you do your practicums and start to work with others outside of the program, again, think about how many people am I positively affecting? How many people am I honestly impressing? And let me build those networks. Let me get a strong background in IO psychology, but also a strong network in people that practice IO psychology. You also want to start learning your IOAs, industrial organizational acronyms. We use a lot. So, for example, the Society for Industrial Organizational Psychology, we call it SIOP. We don't call it SIOP, we call it SIOP. We'll talk a lot about KSAs, knowledge, skills, and abilities. So just also recognize that like any field, we have our jargon and we use it a lot. And you probably want to start making sure that you understand what that jargon is, but also guard against using it too much, because if we use it with people that aren't IO psychologists, we'll often confuse them as well. So I just want to recognize that as a strength and also something to be a little bit aware of as you communicate with others. So let's basically go with a quick introduction to personnel psychology and how it fits in with the rest of industrial organizational psychology. So let's briefly talk about the class. So I know Dr. Dowse during orientation talked about this a little bit. I strongly suggest, if at all possible, you buy a copy of this book. It's probably one of the best books in the market on personnel psychology. I have one sitting here right next to my desk, and I probably break it out less than I used to, but still a fair amount. There will be a fair amount of article readings in this class. Various people are going to be assigned to create one sheets and lead discussions on these in an online format. And again, whether you're reading the article because you are the one leading the discussion or have to create the one sheet, I strongly suggest that you get in the practice of reading every article that's assigned in all of your classes. Part of the process of becoming a science practitioner is not only knowing how to read research articles, but also starting to build up a skill of finding what is the main findings in those research articles, becoming a critical consumer of those research articles. And really the only way to do that is to read a lot of articles, to start to get a good basis for what is a good article versus what is a bad article. I try to choose articles that are generally informative and have a good point to them, but I don't always choose articles that are necessarily the best written or the easiest accessible, because I want to challenge you occasionally. You will have a paper due in this class. I want you to think of it as a bit of a proto-thesis. In other words, this paper should be, if possible, an exploration of at least what you're currently thinking about as a possibility for your thesis. And if you basically to find out, is this something I'm willing to really dive into for 2 years? And if you find by the end of the paper you're getting sick of the subject, you learn something. That's probably not what you should do your thesis on. But if you still have interest at the end of the process, that also is going to tell you that that is probably something that you can now use that paper as kind of a first draft and adapt into your thesis. And I have no problem with you doing that. It's one of the few times in the program where I'm going to tell you it's kind of okay to plagiarize this particular paper towards your thesis. Generally, when you create anything, you should not reuse it. This is a case where I'm telling you it's okay, because that's the purpose of this paper, is to help you start working on your thesis. There will be some tests in this class. They're going to be online. They are going to be open book, and I'll talk about that a little bit more as we get closer to the first one. And again, honestly, the biggest thing you need as a student in any master's program is a passion for learning. You need to be self-directed and wanting to read the chapters that are assigned in the book. You're wanting to read these articles. You need to get some taste for learning more. You want to become a science practitioner in this field. So what is personnel or eye psychology? So it's the primary subfield of IO psychology, and it focuses on individual differences. So it really focuses on individuals and how they differ, but specifically in how we can quantify those differences to make better decisions. So we're looking for individual differences in behaviors, both positive and negative, individual differences in job performance, so actually doing the job that is required for the organization to do well, and all of the methods required to measure and predict these differences. And again, if you can measure differences in skills, differences in knowledge, differences in ability, that can help you make better decisions on how to do training, who needs training, what training methods work. If you can measure it pre and post, you can find out, did the training work? You can use it for selection purposes, for recruitment purposes. You can use it to find out, is the jobs actually doing what they're supposed to do? How overall is the organization performing based on individual performance? You can use it for bonuses, and you can use it for promotions. So pretty much think of it as, whenever we're talking personnel psychology, it's some form of measurement of individual differences with an eye towards an organizational decision. And again, that science practitioner model is a major part of this. In fact, I would argue somewhat that the science practitioner model is even more important when we're working on the I side of IO psychology. Scientists develop knowledge, practitioners apply that knowledge, and we want to make sure there isn't a gap between the two of those. And often these develop. You'll find that most IO psychologists outside of academia tend to be more practitioners than science. And this is because it starts to become easy. We start to get our favorite interventions that have worked most of the time, so why should I go through the whole rigmarole of doing the scientist part? And also, a lot of organizations want practitioners more than they want scientists. Oh, they'll pay for an IO psychologist, and they'll want an IO psychologist there. They'll want the prestige of having a science practitioner. But when you're actually trying to tell them to slow down an intervention for 2 months while you gather data, that often gets shoved to the side. It often also gets cut out of the budget line. So just a recognition of the reality of the situation. If you're working in organizations, especially private organizations, you are going to feel internal and external pressure to start to become more and more a practitioner. You want to be aware of this, though, because you still are bringing value as a scientist. And you should at least keep pushing to keep the scientist involved in the situation. This is the exact opposite, honestly, in academia, where a lot of academics in IO psychology tend to feel a lot of pressure to focus on research and focus on the science of psychology, not necessarily how you apply it. And in fact, a fair amount of well-published IO psychologists almost don't have practical implications to some of their research. That's when you become a pure scientist. You're not actually looking at the science to fuel practice. And that's what we should be doing as well. Any study that we do as an IO psychologist, and this to some degree includes your thesis, should be able to answer the question, so what? Just because you find pure knowledge, that's not enough for us. We want knowledge that informs decision making, that informs policy, that informs interventions to make organizations better. And when you do both, that's when you've bridged the science practitioner gap. You're both. You're a science practitioner, and that's what we want to strive to be. So what do IO psychologists do? What is the I side? Personnel psychology. I often make the joke it's the dark side versus the light side. And what I mean by that is that personnel psychology tends to be more top-down. It tends to be more focused on organizational goals, more directly tied to organizational goals, and a lot of times the top management, the C-suite, and we use the word C-suite often, but that basically means CEO, CFO, that's your C-suite. That's your leaders of your organization. They're often easier to sell I-side interventions because it's more clearly identifiable to them how they're actually making money or saving money in an organization. You can easily quantify, for the most part, that if you can increase productivity by 10% with an intervention, that's going to make 10% more money for the company. But job satisfaction is indirectly related to performance, which might be indirectly related to an outcome. So a lot of times when we're looking at the O side, it's a little less clear exactly how an O side intervention results in profit, actually helps the organization become more successful, while the I side is often a little more directly connected to that. So that's why I refer to it as the dark side, is that it actually is more focused at, in a way, making the owners, the stockholders, the top level of the company happy. It's more sellable to the top level of the organization. And it seems to be, honestly, a little more cutthroat in a way because it is about selection, which means for every person we select, there's someone we don't select. For every person we promote, there's someone we don't promote. And if we're doing performance appraisal correct, for every person we identify as a high performer, we may also be identifying as someone that needs to be terminated from the company. So there's a little bit of that bottom line, how much money is the organization, capitalism, that drives a bit of I-side. Now that doesn't mean I-side is heartless, and in fact it can be done very well in ways that increase job satisfaction, increase motivation, and we don't want to lose sight of those O-side issues either. So we apply psychological principles and methodology to human resource management. We identify the knowledge, skills, and abilities needed to perform jobs, usually through a job analysis, and then we develop and validate tests to measure those knowledge, skills, and abilities, KSAs, through assessment and selection. So once people are in the organization, we then further determine any training and development needs, and then design and develop and test those training programs as we develop and evaluate those training programs. So again, broadly speaking, we're somewhat associated with recruitment through the job analysis. We're definitely involved in identifying and quantifying what a job is and what's required to have that job analysis. And then from that job analysis, which is kind of the base of the entire pyramid of the I-side, we then get involved with selection, training, training needs identification, training design, training evaluation, performance appraisal, and promotion. So basically, we're talking about decision making in an organization that is driven by measurement, research methodology, and statistics, not gut feelings. We're trying to replace just whoever I like with no. Who is the person that actually is going to fit this job the best? If they have a skill that's deficient, how do we train it best? And how do we then identify if they're performing well or performing poorly? And finally, if we want to promote someone, how do we identify someone that actually has the skill sets necessary for the job we're wanting to promote them to, which very well may be a different set of skills than the job they currently hold. That's a sign that you should always make sure that you prep fully before starting a lecture. Human factors. So there's industrial psychology or personnel, there's organizational, there's also human factors. We really don't touch on human factors much in this program, and most industrial organizational psychology programs don't. Basically, industrial organizational psychology kind of started with human factors, and human factors is kind of figuring out how human behavior best interacts with technology. As IO psychology developed, though, more and more focus was on the industrial and the organizational until there became three branches. And at some point, the human factors programs kind of became their own programs. So if you're actually interested in human factors, you usually would get a degree specifically in human factors. And it's basically, like I said, kind of psychology meets engineering, while IO psychology is psychology meets business. So again, we've already talked about industrial psychology. It's recruitment, it's selection, classification, compensation, performance appraisal, and training. And it works hand in hand with organizational, socialization, motivation, occupational stress, leadership, group performance, organizational development. So for example, if we're trying to select someone for a high stress job, we also want to understand about the stress of that job. We want to be able to quantify it. We want to be able to communicate it. We also want to find someone that has good abilities to deal with stress. So that's where there'd be a kind of a leap over to the occupational stress while still being on the I side of the issue. Organizational development is about kind of working at the group level and the organizational level to make it better. And a lot of times those structures will impact recruitment, selection, and classification. So though this chart kind of shows them as two completely separate fields, there is a lot of overlay. If you have a good selection system that also picks people that psychologically or personality-wise are good fits for their job, you're going to find a side effect is they're going to be more socialized, more motivated, and typically have greater job satisfaction, which are all organizational levels. We're kind of focused on performance appraisal on the industrial or personality side. So how well are you actually performing? But someone that has good leadership, is experiencing low levels of occupational stress, is highly motivated, and has high job satisfaction, is also going to perform well. So if we're trying to increase performance, we may also be looking at organizational level interventions. So just kind of recognize that though there are two separate fields of IO psychology, they work very much hand in hand. But of course, in this class, we're just going to be focusing on this side. We're going to be focusing on the I side or personnel. So research that can help narrow the science practitioner gap. This was an article by Cassio and Aquinas in 2008. But basically, they kind of talked about how we need to start making sure that we are remaining scientists while also trying to look at real life problems in organizations. And again, just to focus on that science practitioner gap. And some of the things they found as far as science practitioner gaps was leadership development. So what actual theories of leadership are we using when we're actually trying to become practitioners to develop leaders? Compensation and benefits. So are we actually researching what really is the impact both in someone's life but also someone's psychological state from various benefit packages and compensation? Work-life issues are becoming a major issue in organizations, and those are definitely things where a lot of times we find practitioners just trying to add interventions, trying to add extra benefits to deal with these issues without ever actually coming at it from a theory-based scientific access or framework of why is there a problem in the first place? What is the issue? And is there something we can do about it? And what issue is going to work the best? Definitely attitudes towards aging as we find our workforce is getting a wider and wider gap. And what I mean by that is that both younger people and older people are more likely to be working together in organizations. How do we better manage talent? How do we increase diversity? And again, increasing diversity is a good example of a lot of times we take a practitioner view of this, of simply trying to do interventions to increase the diversity of an organization without necessarily asking how do we need to manage that diversity, how do we make sure that diversity is not only making the organization more diverse or more representative of their client base or customers, but also let's make sure we're doing it in a way that actually makes the organization perform better. Whenever you can do the right thing and also make the organization more successful, that's always the better goal to have. Do what's right and do it in a way that actually helps the organization. And also just globalization and ethics and ethical leadership. All of these are still major issues that are facing major organizations, but also we need to make sure that we're not being pure scientists, just measuring globalization without any real eye towards how we could actually make organizations basically globalize easier with less stress as you have different cultures working together. We want that science practitioner focus on all of these issues. So again, as an industrial organizational psychologist, whatever the issue is, we want to not only identify the problem, we want to measure it, we want to quantify it, and we want to come at it as a detective, as a scientist. We want to have some questions, some hypotheses. This is what we think's wrong, but we want to take those and put them to the test. We want to make sure that we're right about our problem identification. Once we've identified a problem, we want to do research on that problem. We want to find out what are the possible interventions? What are the possible practitioner answers? How have they worked in other organizations? And can we find organizations similar enough to the one that we're in currently that we can trust that what has worked elsewhere will work for our organization? Once we've done the research, we're going to create an intervention. We're going to do an application. We're going to find out and basically apply the practitioner models, the interventions that we found, to try to take care of the problem. But we're not going to end there, and that's often where we as scientists get a little bit more involved than other practitioners, because once we've applied that application, we've applied that intervention, we want to go back and find out, is it working? Did the problem go away? So the challenges of the IO in the 21st century, IO psychology needs to be relevant. We need to keep up on current trends and concerns. In other words, we need to stay being scientists. We need to keep reading research. We need to find out what is the current best practices and how have they worked in other organizations. We also need to be useful. We need to make sure that at all times we are an applied subdiscipline. We're putting theories and research into action, but we need to be able to show to management, to ownership, to stockholders that what we're doing will actually not only help the organization, it will make the organization more profitable and more successful. And that relevance and usefulness is grounded in scientific methodology. That as much as we can, we're going to strive to do it correctly. We're going to strive to use good methodology and good statistics to make sure that what we're doing is actually working.